fantastic bone reader, diviner, scholar, artist. And yeah, really delighted to have you both tonight. I'm super excited. So what we'll do, everyone, is just chat for about 40 minutes. If you have any questions, then do put them in the chat down the side, and if we can get them, we will. But what we'll do after 40 minutes is move to live questions. So if you have anything you'd like to ask, we'll be asking for hands up. It can be a little technologically clunky, but we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. So, animism and alchemy. First, I'd like to start with animism then. Animism, I guess, lies at the very bottom of what Embercombe stands for, really. The profound connection with the natural world. And Stephan, I would love to ask you to begin with, just to tell us kind of from a scientific perspective, what we really mean by animism.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Rachel, for setting this up, and welcome to everyone for being with us. So, animism is really about the perception that everything in the universe basically has a soul, I'd put it like that, or that every atom, every molecule isn't just, you know, meaningless matter, but it has some kind of soul or spirit or some intelligence in it, maybe a little proto-intelligence. Now, of course, in mainstream science, we're told that just can't be the case. You know, it's impossible. I mean, how can a proton or electron have any intelligence? But then you run into a problem, which is it's called the hard problem in science. How do we even begin to explain where our consciousness comes from? I mean, if everything is dead matter, you know, we're made out of atoms, you know, carbon atoms, nitrogen atoms, sulfur atoms, and when those atoms organize themselves into, say, a human body, our human body, we get consciousness out of it. But how is that possible if all the atoms are thought to be without consciousness, sort of dead? I mean, where does the consciousness come from? We've got a big problem there, and we don't know. That's why the scientists don't know. That's why it's called the hard problem in science. You know, where does consciousness come from if matter is dead and soulless and without any spirit? So animism solves the problem by telling us what indigenous people have been telling us ever since we were humans, you know, that matter is sentient. So every now in modern terms, you could say every atom, every molecule has within it a little spark of soul, consciousness, spirit, I don't know what you want to call it, a little spark of something, some meaning, personhood, soul, spirit. And when these little atoms organize themselves as they do in us, you know, into our bodies, then of course we get the emergence of this hyper consciousness that we've got, and dolphins have got, and magpies have got. In fact, I would say earthworms are really intelligent, bees are intelligent, you know, this intelligence is scattered throughout nature. So for me, you know, the word animism comes from the Latin anima, which means soul. Animate, you know, we're animated because we have souls. And I think it's incredibly short-sighted of our culture, Western culture, to say that only human beings have souls, if we have souls at all, of course. That can't be right. The whole of nature must be one great soul. And just to finish, in this animistic view, we see that there are many, many persons, but not all of them are human. That's a famous saying from Graham Harvey, who wrote a book on animism. Graham Harvey, you might want to put that in the chat. Graham Harvey, animism. There are many kinds of persons, but they're not all humans. You know, you can have a rock person, you can have a river person, you can have a cloud person. They're all persons. They all have some kind of soul, and they're all part of this greater soul called the anima mundi, the soul of the world. The universe itself is a great soul, and of course Gaia is a great soul. But science, just to finish, science of course does not recognize any of this. They tell us that we're completely flaky loonies, although more and more scientists like myself and Rachel and other folks are coming round to this view. So okay?
Great, thanks, Stephan. So Colin, there's the challenge to you really. So indigenous traditions have been saying this since humans were here. what do you feel about that, kind of coming from an indigenous tradition yourself? How do you feel about that? What does animism mean to you? Would you add anything to what Stephan said?
Yeah, well, thank you, Rachel, and also to echo Stephan and thanking you for putting all of this together, and the mastery and wizardry of the technology that I can sit here in my room sequestered off in Cape Town and actually talk to you all is nothing short of miraculous. And I must say I'm delighted to be here and excited too. Well, I mean, I think, you know, one of the places that I would start, I mean, just adding really to the very beautiful description that Stephan has given of animism from a scientific perspective and from a kind of a contemporary perspective, is to say that the notion of animism at all is a modern Western notion, in the sense that, you know, if we went back into our pre-industrial ancestry and we sat among people and we started speaking about animism, there would be a lot of blanks, because animism essentially, I think it suggests obviously that there's a differential at some level between what lives and what doesn't live, what has a soul and what doesn't have a soul, what's alive and what isn't alive. And I have a suspicion that this is an unprecedented schism. I don't think that any culture before us, before our modern contemporary Western industrialized culture, would have had such a schism. And so the presence of a schism necessitates the bringing in of this word to describe a culture in which that schism doesn't exist, wherein everything has a soul, as Stephan said, and everything is alive, and therefore we can relate to it, we can have a relationship with it. To have a relationship with a thing doesn't seem possible, and yet as soon as it becomes someone, as soon as it becomes a who rather than a what, there's a capacity within us to relate to it. And so, you know, there's a unity in the cosmology of traditional frameworks wherein everything is part of the great relating, is part of the great relationship, and can be related to and is related to as entities. So, you know, everything has consciousness in it and is in some sense part of the great consciousness of all things and contributing to it. You know, I think there's you know, I think of gravity. I mean, gravity is this extraordinary quality that exists in the universe. And where does gravity come from? Well, it's inherent in the universe. It's there as soon as there's a physical body, and as soon as physicality comes into being, there's gravitational presence. In the same way, I think we could say that as soon as anything is present in an animistic universe, it has consciousness. So in as much as gravity is ubiquitous to the totality of everything, so too awareness or consciousness is ubiquitous from an animistic point of view.
So you talk about this schism, Colin. Is there any kind of unifying in our Western industrialized culture? A schism has happened. Is there a way to put it, to get over the schism then? You know, why is it important right now then that we even talk about animism? It seems to me that animism is something that a lot of people are becoming interested in. Why now, and what do we need to do?
Well, I mean, yes, I think it's vitally important, and part of the reason I say that is I think because this schism exists, we are in the predicament that we are right now in the sixth great extinction. You know, to the extent that most of the rest of the living planet is not really seen as conscious or as conscious as we are human, and therefore doesn't have a commune within the human domain. We objectify the rest of creation, so to speak. And a mountain becomes an it becomes so much granite to be mined and used to build houses, and rivers become so much water to be dammed and utilized, and the oceans become the manner of transport or wave action, whatever it is, we see, and trees become planks. So to that extent, then we find ourselves in the situation that we are now, where we're literally devouring the rest of life on this planet, and so I think it's absolutely critical that we revisit the very fundaments of what our cosmology, our current cosmology tells us about the universe, and really, really deeply rethink it. And of course, one might ask, but how do we do that? Well, one way to do it is to kind of go back and have a look at where we were before we got to this place. Was there a time when we saw things differently? And how can we begin to rethink our cosmology in terms of a better way of relating in the future? So, this is where indigenous traditions come in, and certainly those that still remain, that have a so-called animist way of seeing, or animistic way of seeing the world. We can relearn or remember or recall perhaps a lot of how we would once have seen the world, and how we would, more importantly, have related to the rest of the living universe. And in that sense, as Thomas Berry might put it, become a communion of subjects rather than a collection of objects. And in that process, re-look at the whole way we see ourselves in terms of what we are as human beings. What does it mean to be human in a living universe? What does it mean to be a human in the commune of the great living universe, I suppose? And I think, how do we do this? Well, I think we start by renegotiating with ourselves, in a certain sense, what being human means, and what it means to be in this time of extraordinary crisis, and what that crisis is, in a sense, calling of us. What are we asked? How are we asked to engage with the crisis? How do we re-look at pretty much everything about what being human has thus far meant, and re-examining the whole notion of our way of seeing everything, really.
Yeah. There are millions of questions I could ask you there, Colin, not least how you're doing that renegotiation. But can I just pop to Stephan for a moment? How would you respond to that, Stephan?
Well, I think Colin's absolutely right. We have to get back to a way of seeing that we had before science, actually, because I think the problem, you could, just to simplify, you could say the problem started with science, or rather, it started before the scientific revolution in the 16th, 17th centuries. But when we got Descartes telling us that there are these two separate substances that are completely different, the human psyche, or the soul, which was connected to God, and then everything else outside ourselves, which is just dead stuff. That was brewing in the culture for a long time. But when Descartes came along, that split was made absolute and final. And we've all been brought up in that split, particularly if you're a scientist, like myself. It's really drummed into you very, very effectively. So the question is, as Colin said, how can we get back to the pre-scientific view of things, in which people did see the world as much as alive? I mean, the view in the medieval world, how we used to see things in the West. We used to think the Earth was at the center of a womb-like universe. It was a womb. The universe was a womb, and there were each planet was on its own crystalline sphere, and there was music between those spheres. And when you were born, you would come through the qualities of each of the planets and pick up their qualities as your soul came down into incarnation on the Earth. I mean, that's a beautiful view. I mean, it's completely wrong scientifically, but is it wrong inwardly, psychologically? No. There's something of tremendous value in that view, but you mustn't take it literally. You have to take it poetically. So in other words, one way we can get back, as Colin was saying, to a pre-scientific view, if we're Westerners, is to cultivate our poetry, to be poetic, and that's why I like alchemy very much, which I'm sure we're going to come on to, but to contemplate certain images which stimulate our poetic sensibilities, or if you like, stimulate our imagination with a capital I. So that's our task. We have to unify that with our science. We shouldn't be throwing away science because it's tremendously valuable, but we need to bring it together like this with our feeling. You know, science is all about thinking. Now we need feeling. Feeling is shriveled. This is science. This thinking. This is feeling. Our feeling has shriveled in our culture because thinking has become too dominant, and it's made it shrivel. It's embarrassing to feel. You know, but the feeling is very important. It needs to come back up, and we need to put them together. And the feeling is not about emotion. It's about valuing the importance, perceiving the value of something, perceiving the value of a non-human being, of a tree, of a rock, of a mountain. We perceive. It's not something you think, you have to perceive. And that makes it more difficult. Thinking is easy, feeling or valuing is more difficult. But that's our task. If we don't do that, as Colin says, if we don't do that, we haven't got a future on this planet. Our Gaia will wipe out our civilization, as she's doing now. You know, the virus is a little taste of what's coming with climate change. We've got to do this. We've got to start doing this work. And to finish, to do that, we each have to do it within ourselves. It's no good waiting for someone else to do it. We have to, each one of us needs to find this poetic sensitivity towards the animistic nature of the world in ourselves, however we can do that. That's the task. It's a big task.
Fantastic, fantastic. What would be your recommendation, Colin, for that renegotiation, that poetic sensitivity? Do you have anything that you would recommend?
Well, I mean, what it boils down to really is relationship, on all the biggest sense of what that word implies. And relationship has a requisite of reciprocity, of interaction in a certain sense. And so when we look at a mountain, the extent to which we commodify the mountain, the extent to which we objectify it and turn it into so much potential granite, that becomes a very a problematic relationship. I mean, if we did that to another person, there would not really be, it wouldn't be long before there was a complete breakdown in relationship. And I think this is really at the heart of the issue that we have as a human collective in relation to the rest of nature. The relationship is broken down, and it's fundamentally broken down because of this differential between the human and human consciousness, which is kind of elevated into some sort of a place above everything else, and everything else is subjugated in service to that consciousness. And its consciousness is diminished, or in many cases completely obliterated, as part of our recognition within the human collective. And so part of the restoration has to be, first of all, the recognition of the potential for genuinely relating to the rest of nature, and then to begin to question what we would need to start doing as practices, as interactive processes to begin to restore relationship, in the same way that we might if we'd objectified another person and the relationship had broken down as a result of that. So how do we restore mutuality in our relationship with mountains, with rivers, with the oceans, with birds, with everyone that we share the universe with? And our pre-industrial predecessors in our own culture and those indigenous cultures that do still exist in the world are very good teachers for this, because their practices, their ways of relating, their ways of understanding, their cosmologies really represent this potential for a whole and functional relationship between us and the rest of the living planet. Furthermore, we have to, in a certain sense, dethrone ourselves, take ourselves off this platform which says, you know, that the human race has somehow triumphed over the rest of nature and subjugated the rest of nature to its service, and bring ourselves back into a place of, in a certain sense, feeling part of nature, part of the whole process, an integral part of the process. Not custodians of nature or managers of nature or utilizers of nature, but contributors to all that, you know, the natural world and the natural universe is. and become, in a certain sense, communal participants, I would say. And that's something, again, that we need to look at within our own collective as well, because what is breaking down in our own collective is our sense of commune. We're becoming more and more isolated and insular, polarized, and so on, and our communal frameworks are breaking down. And this is just, it's another symptom of the same breakdown that's happened between us and the rest of the natural world.
Could you say a little bit about ritual, Colin, as technology is the wrong word, but ritual as a process then for that communalizing, that conversation, that kind of two-way
yes
discussion? Sorry.
Ritual is a huge subject, but anyway,
yeah,
I can go with this. In a certain sense, ritual is an enactment of relationship, really, I think, at one level. I mean, there are lots of different angles that we could come at ritual from. But if you think about the ritual of matrimony in Western culture, wherein two people come together and in front of a gathering of people and in front of something much bigger than us, in a church or wherever, we proclaim our commitment to each other. And that ritual is essentially all about the proclamation of commitment. What are we committing to? Well, we're committing to the vows of marriage, as we state them in that particular ritual. And so in a sense, that's quite a nice encapsulation, really, of what I think ritual is in general, in all its different ways, in all its different forms. We have ancestral rituals, and then who are the ancestors, and we have nature rituals, and we have sacred sites where there are rituals that are, part. But all of them, really, when you boil it down, are methods, are ways, are formalities that represent our capacity to relate and to formalize that relating and to make statements of commitment in relation to that relationship. So when we go to a sacred site and we perform specific rituals that are specific to that sacred site, we're relating to that sacred site. And many of those rituals have to do with commitments that we're willing to take on in exchange for relationship with that site. And so I think that's probably one of the most important aspects of relationship, and one of the ways in which relationship in our contemporary world can be very profoundly used to heal relationship.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Sorry for putting you on the spot there, Colin. I'm kind of going to go back to you, Stephan. I'm aware of time, and I know that kind of ritual is kind of like a segue as well into your work on alchemy, gaian alchemy. We're getting mentions of it in the chat here as well. Now, I know that you're writing a fantastic book called Gaian Alchemy. I know nothing about it other than I'm desperate to read a draft. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how that relates to what we're talking about here?
Yes, well, Gaian Alchemy is doing what Colin and what we've been talking about up till now. It's bringing these two sides of ourselves together, our thinking and our valuing, as I was mentioning. Alchemy was being practiced here in the West. I mean, not just in the West, but Western alchemy was going on here long before science. And the alchemists were really interested in what is matter, what is nature. So they had a really burning question. They were really, since the best of them, of course, the worst of them were trying to make gold out of lead, which is impossible, But the best of them were asking about nature, what is matter? And they were doing experiments with various substances in their retorts, trying to answer that question. But what they didn't realize is that, remember, of course, they were all animists in those days, and this was before science. But what they didn't realize was that by being so sincere in asking that question about what is matter, what is nature, and being so sincere, it's as if the deepest layers of nature nature itself, which Jung would call the collective unconscious, responded with certain images. So these images came through the alchemists, and they wrote them down. And the images actually came from nature. They didn't invent them. They came from nature. And we can use these images today to reconnect ourselves with nature. So what I'm trying to do in my book and in my work is to see if we can take the images from alchemy, which come from the depths of the psyche, from nature herself, about herself, and combine them with the science of Gaia, with our modern scientific understanding of how the earth works. Because in alchemy, there are various, let's say, 7 fundamental transformative processes, which all of nature undergoes. I mean, you can have more than 7, but 7 seems to be the fundamental number of transformative processes or dynamics or experiences that we go through as a human being on our pathway to what we could say is being fully embodied in this earth, fully alive, fully connected with the living soul of nature, as Colin was saying, you know, with the animistic nature of things. There are 7 processes we go through to finding that. That's called the philosopher's stone in alchemy. But I also think the earth herself, Gaia herself, has gone through 7 stages of transformation during her long existence throughout geological time. But also these 7 processes are happening on every single scale. They're happening on our cells, in molecules, in our organs, in our psyche, in the economy, they're everywhere, in human relationships, they're everywhere. These 7 transformative processes are everywhere. So what I'm trying to do is to see if I can link those images of those processes, because we have images of them. I mean, I can show you some pictures if you like. With our understanding of Gaia from science, to see if it's possible like that to pop into a lived experience of the actual massive animistic nature of Gaia, the living presence of Gaia as a lived experience, because that will help us to reconnect with Gaia, which is what we need to do. But it's basing it on our own Western tradition, our own Western spiritual tradition or cosmology, which is alchemy. Alchemy is incredibly holistic. Jung discovered this, of course, you know, the great Swiss psychologist, who we need to listen to a lot more than Freud.
Can you show us some pictures then, Stephan, if you've got them there?
Well, okay, here's one picture. I could show you the actual, well, let's try this one. I don't know if you can see that. You probably, hang on, let me try. It's a beautiful image. Yeah. Oh, I know, hang on, wait a minute. I know the one I want to show you. It's just here, which our son Oscar drew for me. Now let me see, hang on. Can you see that? It's a mandala.
Yes, wow.
And it's not the complete picture because there's things going on outside which he hasn't drawn yet. This is called the Azov of the philosophers. And there you can see there are 7 stars. And each of these rays is an alchemical process or a process in nature. And these are little pictures that relate. And if you meditate on this, as I've been doing for a few years now, you meditate on this, your consciousness starts to get animistic. You just can't help it. You know, you meditate on this, you go outside and everything feels much more alive. And what I'm doing in my book, Gaia Alchemy, is combining this with the science of Gaia. So for example, this one is called calcination. That's when you sort of need to heat things up and reduce things to ash, you know, like your own psyche and things in yourself, you need to be reduced to ash. Your prejudices, you know, your blind ways your fixed ways of seeing. Then you need to dissolve it. So the dissolution. That's the next one is dissolution. You dissolve all that. Then you separate things. You discriminate what's going on. Then you join them together. Then you ferment it all, and then you distill it, and then you coagulate. You enter a new state of consciousness. So in Gaia, this calcination, you could say, is when the earth first came together in a great molten ball of rock. Dissolution was the first rainfall. Separation is when the atoms and molecules from the rock started to separate out. Conjunction, this one, is when all the molecules form life. Fermentation is life developing. Distillation is getting more developed. And coagulation, I think, is for us, is when we become gaian beings. So I hope I've given you a sort of idea of how I'm trying to use this.
Wow. So you're saying that what the alchemists were doing, because obviously, you know, lots of people have different theories on what the alchemists were doing, but you're saying that what they were really trying to do was reconnect with the soul of the world.
Yes, they felt matter had a soul and a spirit, which was hidden away in matter. And our role as humans using alchemy is to discover that soul and unify with it. That way, the whole of matter would be raised to a higher level of consciousness, and so would we. and we would live in peace and harmony as much as possible with each other and with the whole of nature.
Wow.
And I think we can, that's fantastic. And now we can bring the science of Gaia into it as well. And that redeems science. Well, I'm being a bit ambitious, but it brings soul back into science. It gives soul it gives science what it's been missing for 400 years, which is soul. And it's interesting that recently conservation biologists who are dealing with extinction, they've started getting really disturbed about what they're seeing, and they can't deal with these feelings they're having. They're having feelings of despair and horror. And that's good, because that's at last feeling coming back into science. And what I'd like to do is work with some of these conservation biologists. I was one of those myself, and gently see if alchemical images can help them to deal with these terrible feelings that they're having about the destruction of nature.
Wow, wow, that's fantastic. But Colin, what's the indigenous, well, from your indigenous tradition, what's the equivalent of what Stephan is doing then, or do we not need to talk about equivalence because there wasn't the separation in the first place? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think that's where I would start. I think, you know, in a certain sense, I mean, I wonder in this, you know, alchemy, the extraordinary way in which alchemy, well, the way it brings together the schism, you know, between our kind of objectification of the rest of nature and our human position in relation to that. Everything that Stephan speaks about there is inherently already present in a collective cultural framework and in an animistic framework. So you wouldn't necessarily have a specific methodology or a system or even a philosophy of trying to repair that, of trying to find the soul once again in something. Because the manner in which the cosmology is set up in the first place has that inherent presence of the soul in everything already. And so everything is present. And what's hard for us as we sit here now is and we look in on pre-industrial culture, on our own pre-industrial ancestry, is that we're in some ways, we're so distant from it now that it's literally a different cognitive system. And so we're trying to make translation across a vast void, I suppose, between one way of seeing and thinking and feeling and experiencing and another, which is really very different. And so it makes it quite hard to even talk about it, you know, because to the extent that we're looking in on these frameworks, we're constantly filtering them and reconstructing them. We're deconstructing them and reconstructing them within our own Western framework. And so the answer, I think, ultimately is absolutely everything that Stephan was so beautifully describing there in terms of alchemy is very much part of an animistic framework. It's inherently present. It's the idea of a soul in everything, and the idea that my soul and the soul of a rock or the soul of a fish or the soul of a mountain or the soul of the river are in some way inextricably in relationship constantly all the time, and that everything I do is in some way informed by that is fundamental to an animistic way of seeing things. And if we go back far enough to the times when animistic cultures were complete and existent, and I'm not really sure it's true to say there are any anymore. You know, there are, but you know, they've all got their problems at this point. But if we were able to, you know, we would find a way of relating that is that doesn't require any kind of system of regenerating that notion in the first place.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, I would just say that I completely agree with Colin, but I would say that alchemy is one of the animistic traditions of the West. I mean, the alchemists were all animists. So it's our animistic tradition. It's a very strong tradition that we've got.
I'm interested as well in somebody's mentioned James Hillman in the chat here, and you mentioned Carl Jung yourself, Stephan. I mean, it feels like that was an attempt from psychology to kind of get over this rift, you know, this linked to the collective unconscious, you know, is effectively what you're doing from a different trajectory. Can you say anything more about Jung and Hillman and their psychological work?
Yeah, Hillman's very interesting because he says language is so important, and he says that the Jungian terminology, anima, shadow, all of those sort of words which Jungians use a lot, he finds distances us from the soul of things. He prefers alchemical language, for example, calcination or dissolution. These are actual physical operations that you do with matter itself. And he feels that this brings you closer. He's written a great book called Alchemical Psychology, which I've got here, which is well worth reading. Alchemical Psychology. And Jung, you know, he discovered, well, he went through a tremendous confrontation with the unconscious. Normally, someone who had experienced that sort of thing would become schizophrenic or psychotic. But he was a medical doctor, so he was going through that to help his patients. And then later on, he discovered that the alchemists had found similar experiences in their own work. And he realized this is something objective. There's an objective psyche. And it speaks through images. It speaks through images, like dreams speak to us through images. So the alchemical images come from nature. We haven't created them. They've been given to us by nature. And if we contemplate them, we get back to nature. This is what Jung and Hillman both found. And one can find that for oneself by trying it out. And
that's effectively what you're doing, which is fantastic.
That's what I'm trying to do. Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in Jung and Hillman, but I want to. Is it true for me or not? I don't want to just take on, you know, a set of beliefs that, like a credo. That's no good. It's got to be based on personal experience. And have I experienced anything like that? Well, yeah, I would say yes. I mean, but I'm not special in any way. Anyone can experience it if you approach this material, alchemical material, with an open mind, an open heart, and you know, just work with let the images work on you. Use them as a meditation. Take an image and let it work on you for a day. Carry the image around with you. See what happens. I mean, I found it's wonderfully connecting with nature.
Somebody's asking here, what sources would you recommend for kind of getting closer to alchemy? Is there anything off the top of your head that you would say you must look at these images?
I think a really good start is this book by Dennis Hauck, H-A-U-K, called The Emerald Tablet, H-A-U-C-K, sorry. This is a very nice book. Dennis William Hauck, can you see that? The Emerald Tablet.
Yeah.
That's a good start. Then, of course, Jung is harder to read, but you could read Memories, Dreams and Reflections, his autobiography. There's a chapter there on alchemy. And then you could try this book I showed you by James Hillman, Alchemical Psychology. That's well worth doing, we're looking at. But I mean, Hauck is a good place to start.
When will your book be out, Stephan? We're all hanging here.
I'm just going through I've got written the whole thing. I'm just going through it now, refining it. And then I have to look for a publisher. I haven't got a publisher yet. I don't know if anyone will publish it, to be honest with you, given the current situation with the virus, and small publishers aren't publishing books. So I don't know what I'm going to do with it. But maybe I'll have to self-publish it. I hope not. So if anyone out there can suggest a publisher or is a publisher, please get in touch.
Sister Mystica, Ben is saying, Martin Shaw would probably publish it for you. Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, so we've got a lot of questions coming in. I'll try and do as many from the chat as I can, and then we'll move to some live questions as well. Here's a good one from Susie. Can anyone develop an animistic tradition or practice without having a deep relationship to land, or a specific piece of land or a place? Maybe Colin, if you could answer that one first.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't think that anyone can develop an animistic relationship without having a deep relationship to land and place and all that goes with that. That said, I don't know that it matters too much where that land or that place is. So I don't think we need to be in the heart of pristine wilderness, for example, to develop an animistic relationship with the natural world. The natural world is all around us. It's part of who we are. It's part of everything. So working with practices that forge relationship. And how do we do that? Well, I think to some extent we can take it back into our own domain as humans and say, well, what goes into a human relationship? You know, what are the components that make human, what that deepen human relationship and that sustain human relationship? Well, commitment seems to be one aspect of it. We're committed to the relationship. Mutuality, the other, has as much of a place in that relationship as the self. Consistency, we go back and we go back and we go back and we go back. And if we start, and those are just a few of them, if we start applying those notions of relationship to a mountain or a river or a tree or, you know, a shrub in our back garden for that matter, relationship begins to happen. And so I think that's probably the fundamental way in which an animistic sense of things can really be developed in a very simple way. You know, we find places, we find aspects of, well, the natural world wherever they are, and we commit to some kind of relating process with them at some level, and we cultivate that quality of relatedness, and we apply all that we would apply to a human relationship to that relationship, you know, because all of that does apply. You know, if we're not consistent, then relationship is going to break down. If it's not mutual, it's again going to break down. But if we cultivate those qualities, then relationship is inevitable. And when relationship begins to really take form and strengthen across the barrier of what we see between what we currently see as subject and object, when we become subjects in unity as opposed to subject and object, then an animistic way of seeing things is already happening. That's what it is, really.
We have a question here for you, Colin. What's your personal practice?
Well, I mean, over the years, I was lucky enough to grow up in wilderness and in pristine wilderness at that, and among people who were at that time animistic, the big crisis for me is that all that's kind of gone at this point. Southern Africa has been very, very globalized over the last 30, particularly, well, much longer than 30 years, but, you know, since I left Botswana 30 odd years ago, it's really been hard hit. And I've kind of been going more and more into crisis as a result of that. And what I've been trying to do is figure out for myself, you know, what my practice really is at this point. And, you know, I think my practice at this point, as much as anything, is teaching, talking, revivifying what I've experienced and trying to apply that in my present world. Trying to find ways of constantly relating to the universe around me in a way that understands it as a commune, as that to whom I'm relating, as opposed to that to which I'm relating. So, I mean, there's a lot of different things that I do. I have, traditional practice. I have divination practice. I do nature retreats. I do visual facilitations, and all of that is part of my practice. I'd say I learn probably the most in relation to all the stuff that I talk about when I'm working with other people and helping them find a way of doing it as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And you do it beautifully with other people as well. I've experienced that. So, okay, another question, maybe this one for you, Stephan. How does this relate to dark matter?
Dark matter. Well,
yes, if that's the question you can answer.
Sure. Well, dark matter is a hypothesis. I don't think we have any scientific evidence for it. I actually don't believe in dark matter. I don't think it exists. I think what's happening is more along the lines of Rupert Sheldrake and his ideas. He's taught at the college many times, which is that the gravitational constant isn't a constant. In other words, it changes, it's different in different parts of the universe, and that would explain dark matter. I know there are some scientists who are following this idea. It's called MOND, the acronym for this idea. MOND, I don't remember what it stands for. So I think dark matter probably will be shown to be non-existent. And it's actually that the universe is much more diverse and varied than we think it is. You know, we like to think there's a constant gravitational attraction everywhere in the universe, but that probably isn't the case. It probably varies from place to place in the universe. I don't know if that answers the question about that. Was a scientific question. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. I think we would like to open it up to any live questions, and I'm sure we have some. This is where we get a bit glitchy, but let's go for it. There are two ways to do this. Either raise your hand electronically, which is under either reactions or participants, or just wave your hand and I'll see if I can spot you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, do we have any questions?
Perhaps there's nobody who wants to.
Ben Holden, if
Okay.
you would like to unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello.
Fantastic. Hello, hello. Someone asked a question that I thought was fantastic. Let me see. I think it was Sue Blackburn asked, what is alchemy's relationship with phenomenology and Goethean science?
All right. What is alchemy's relationship with phenomenology and Goethean science? Well, I think they mutually enhance each other. I mean, Goethean science is about putting your thinking to one side, you know, gently moving it to one side, so you can actually perceive the qualities of say a flower or a plant. Let's work with the plant. So you start really looking at the plant in great detail. It starts speaking to you of itself from its own inner being. And phenomenology is the same. It's about just letting things be from within themselves as themselves, and a direct perception of the actual nature of something else. You're involved, of course. So the relationship is actually, as Colin said, it's a reciprocal relationship between you and the other subject you're working with. And alchemy, in my experience, helps you do that. And it helps to put the thinking mind in its rightful place. In other words, it cultivates the imagination, cultivates the ability to perceive the subjectivity of another being, or the soul within another being. It actually cultivates that. Working with these images does that for you if you do it properly. But you have, the whole thing is to dethrone your thinking and put it on the back burner for a while, and your critical mind, put it in the back burner and just see. You see what's going. You just look, be yourself, and really see what's going on in nature. So I think alchemy, phenomenology, and Goethean science are all different ways of cultivating the imagination, and they can help each other to help us do that, to connect with our poetic side, our imagination, or you could say our feeling and our intuition, which is what's deficient in our culture. Does that make any sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
brilliant. Thank you, Stephan. Anybody else got a hand in the air? Any more questions that I can see? Nusha, if you can see anybody, let me know.
Yeah, there's Richard. He's got his hand up.
Brilliant. Richard, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi. Well, first of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to for you guys for pitching up this evening, and it's been really great to hear you. And my question revolves around indigenous wisdom, and I have a certain amount of experience of teachings, and I found it extraordinarily useful in developing connections with nature. Most of them seem to be through sort of Lakota tradition, also the witch elves and so on. I've had a little bit of a connection with African indigenous wisdom, but I just think it's and I know that a lot of these ancient traditions are dying out because the shamans and so on are dropping dead, and the young people don't want to take it up. but I just think there's a wonderful resource there, and can that not be harvested?
Sounds like a question for you, Colin.
Well, yes. I mean, I think, you know, that what indigenous traditions reflect in a certain sense is our own deep ancestry, that part of ourselves that predates our modern way of seeing things. And therefore, who they are and what they are a way of accessing a part of ourselves that is that has to some extent been kind of separated out from our current way of being. And I think, yes, I think it's very important to recognize that part of ourselves represented, but in indigenous and traditional cultural frameworks, but also is very important to, I think, in a certain way, bring that back within ourselves and recognize it as an inherent quality within who we are, as opposed to something out there that has been long lost and forgotten. You know, when we start doing very simple practices very quickly, much of what we would find in pre-industrial cultural frameworks begins to emerge from within ourselves and from within our own collective. So I think simply, in very simple terms, beginning to practice relationship in the biggest sense of that word begins to hearken into and vivify and resuscitate that part of ourselves that indigenous cultures in a certain way represent, and bring it back and recollect it and regather it within ourselves. So I think in a way we're in the business of recollecting and regathering, and you know, and the reason that traditional cultures are dying out at this point in time is because that part of ourselves is being subjugated further and further and further down into the unconscious aspect of ourselves. And so to begin to do practices which in our modern terms would seem irrational, you know, going and sitting under a tree and trying to have a relationship with a tree, or going and sitting on a mountain and trying to have a relationship with a mountain as an entity, would seem irrational in our Western way of seeing things. But if we do that, if we begin to do that, if we go against this notion that it's an irrational practice and we simply start doing those practices, very quickly things start happening. And what starts happening in actual fact is that those much older parts of ourselves, those older relational aspects of ourselves begin to emerge and regather life and regather. And if enough of us do that, it will start to emerge once again within our cultural framework and begin to reanimate, I guess, our way of relating.
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting take. And I suppose that it can easily become a distraction. You get involved in a particular tradition or whatever. But in my experience, there is a definite truth there that it can smooth the pathways, as it might be one way to put it, to having had a sort of few experiences working with indigenous ancestors or whatever. It's kind of, you get these connections on steroids, if you like, with my experience. And I think, well, there's a huge gift there. But it's also interesting, interesting to hear what you say and actually developing your own personal connections rather than leaning on somebody else's traditions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I must take one from the lovely Tim, because I didn't this time last week because we ran out of time. So Tim, can you unmute yourself?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hello Tim. Yeah.
What I wanted to speak to was something that engages me more and more all the time. Is the natural world kind of takes care of itself very well. The world that's kind of really damaged is the man-made world. And this is the world that we've kind of stripped so much more of soul. And yet the bricks of my house still long for the community of beings that they once existed with. And the wood in the door still longs for the forest and the community of beings it once lived with. And how, so it seems to me, you know, so many of the problems we have as people are from the human world and the world we have built. And so much of the job, it seems to me, is to somehow, how do we reanimate? How do we help reanimate the man-made world? It's still got a voice there, but it's so ignored, and it's killing everybody, because people are living, as Colin said earlier, in more and more isolated ways, and it's still a community of objects, of things, of living things around us. But the shopping malls that we live in are, visit, and so much of it is so damaging for people. So I'd love to hear how you would answer that, how you would speak to that.
Well, if I may say just a little bit, and then I've only got 3 minutes left, so I want to hear what Colin has to say too. I would say, if we had respect for every single atom and molecule, out of which our shopping malls are made and everything, everything else is made, we wouldn't have shopping malls. Well, maybe we would, but there'd be more like an indigenous market, maybe. Everything would be made with great respect and care for the sentience in the atoms and molecules of the wood or the metal. So it would be a completely different world if we had that deep respect for the sentience of other beings. Another, just to finish, one thing, I think you said at the beginning, the world of nature can take care of itself. Yes, but it's not going to be able to take care of itself very well anymore after what we've done to it. It's going to be quite severely damaged. So maybe Colin would like to say something, because we're running out. We've got just 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what you said earlier, Stephan, which is that, it comes back to each one of us within ourselves, starting there and beginning to relook at the whole question of relationship and this question of how we relate to all that we would see as other than human. And questioning very deeply what it means to be genuinely in relationship, and what it means to be relating in a way that is detrimental to relationship. So the extent to which we see anything as merely existent for our own benefit, the relationship is already broken down from that point onwards. So to kind of take ourselves out of this position of being that to which everything else is somehow in service, I think is one of the first steps. And we can do that individually. We can begin to relate to our houses not simply as objects or commodities, but as living beings in their own right. They have their own souls, they have their own atmospheres, they have their own sense of themselves. The communities of trees and plants that exist around us, the creatures that live in our houses. When ants come on the counter, our tendency is to kind of reach for a tin of something or other to get rid of them because they're a nuisance. But what would happen if we began in some way to relate to everything that's going on and to find relationship in it? It's a tough business for us as Western people at this point, because we've come such a long way from that. And so restoring that capacity within us is going to take a lot of swimming upstream in terms of our current cultural paradigm. We're going to have to really, really, really work against the gravitational force of our present mainstream cultural framework. And that's the hard part. But if we start doing it in daily life, we start to question our relationship with absolutely everything and begin to apply the precepts and concepts that surround relationship from one human to another to everything, and begin negotiating with that and experimenting with it and exploring what that actually means, then I think we're well on the way to starting some kind of restoration.
Wow. Wonderful. Thank you, Colin. Thank you both for getting fantastic questions on the chat, which we don't have time for, I'm afraid. Both of our wonderful speakers tonight will be coming to Embercombe beginning of next year on our Contemporary Animism course. Hopefully we'll get a chance to speak with them again before then too. I have one, I'm going to sneak this one last question in from Ben, because it's such a good question, Stephan. I wondered if you might just be able to answer it in one word, and then perhaps we can go away and research your answer. If Gaia is evolving through the alchemical process, which phase are we in now? Can you do that in one word?
Yeah, we're in calcination.
Okay, fantastic. We'll go and research that.
We're burning up the earth. We're heating it up and burning it up.
Okay, calcination. Fantastic. Thank you you two for coming. Could go on for hours. Maybe we can sometime another time. Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you to Cindy and Nusha for being our wonderful hosts. And please join us next week with Stephen Jenkinson to talk about the things that Stephen Jenkinson talks about: grief, wisdom. It'll be wonderful, and I'll see you there. Hopefully we'll all see you there. All right. Have a lovely evening, everybody. Thank you.
Very much. I really enjoyed